So I want to be honest with you about something before we get into all this. I started this particular channel wanting to prove something specific. I wanted to prove that XRP was going to work. That's all. That the thesis was real, that the people paying attention to this particular project would be vindicated. That was my entire purpose. And the more I dug in, the more I found legislation moving, institutions positioning, the actual infrastructure being built in plain sight, while most people were looking somewhere completely different. But then something started to shift, not in the evidence. Actually, the evidence like kept pointing in the same direction. It actually got clearer. But what shifted was the questions that I was asking to research. Because the more I understood about what was being built, the more I started asking who was all this actually being built for. And let me tell you what happened last week because I think it's important to like what I'm going to talk about and it really matters. So the DTCC, which is the backbone of the entire US financial system, the institution that processes roughly 4.7 quadrillion dollars in security transactions every year. I can't even wrap my head around what that number means, but it's a lot. They announced that it is connecting its tokenized securities platform to the Stellar blockchain, which is also known as XLM. And I've talked about that in the previous video if you want to dig back and look into it. I did like a deep dive on it. But this would cover stocks for the US market, ETFs, US Treasuries, all on a public chain. And this would happen by the first half of 2027. And this all isn't happening like at once. It's not like a magic date that everything happens, but the DTCC begins live tokenized trades this July, like in a month or so, or July 2026, whenever you see this, with a small controlled group. And there's going to be real assets involved, real transactions, real money. And I think you can think of it more like a stress test or like a soft launch when a restaurant opens. And then there'll be a full commercial launch that follows it around October of 2026. And Stellar, the public blockchain piece, connects in the first half of 2027. So the entire thing is staged, sequenced, and it's going to be one piece at a time. And if you follow this space really closely, you probably saw that last week with the announcement, XLM or Stellar jumped 40% after the news came out. But here's the part most people, I don't think they're talking about at all. In March 2025, the DTCC quietly published a patent, and there was no like huge press release about it. There was no announcement. It was just filed and published, and it's been sitting in public record, available to like anyone that could look. And and I actually didn't even see this whole thing until like digging into this. And the patent describes the underlying architecture of how all of this is going to work. And inside the patent, they named two networks like explicitly. And one of them was Stellar, which is going to be for low cost transactions, fiat ramps, and stablecoin integration. And another one that was mentioned was XRP Ledger for institutional cross border settlement at very high throughput. So Stellar actually got the headline last week, but XRP has been in the blueprint for over a year now. And that patent didn't exist in isolation because while it was sitting in public record, legislation was moving or has been moving through Congress at the same time with the Clarity Act. And also Ripple as a company, the parent company over XRP, was acquiring Hidden Road and landing on DTCC's own clearing directory. And every single major institution that has ever controlled how money moves, it seems, was quietly taking a seat at this new table. There's BlackRock, there's Goldman Sachs, there's JP Morgan, Citi, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Ripple Prime, Circle, Coinbase, NASDAQ, the New York Stock Exchange, all together, one table. Like literally, like almost everything you know in US finance. And it's not just the DTCC that's moving. Also, the SEC and the CFTC, the two separate like governing bodies that regulate all of American finance, they have spent decades, literally decades, in a turf war over like who gets to like have jurisdiction over certain products and such, and they've been competing in this jurisdiction over markets, and that tension has created a lot of confusion for many decades. And in January of this year, January 2026, they announced a joint initiative, which they called Project Crypto, to coordinate federal oversight of digital assets for the first time. And in March, they issued a joint interpretation that is a binding, like, that's binding on both agencies. And it's not like a suggestion, it's not like a staff guidance, but it's actually binding of how they're going to work together. And also, above that, Congress is moving legislation that could pass by, it's expected by the end of this year, to make jurisdictional lines like permanent around blockchain and crypto. And none of this has been loud at all. Like, you really have to be paying attention. And but I also think all of it's connected. And in a moment where you can't get anyone in Washington D.C. to like agree on anything, where it feels like division feels like the only thing that's being produced, if you like look, all of this is moving together almost in unison, like perfect unison, quietly. And behind everything else, people like, it's like happening behind what people are actually paying attention to, because there's so many distractions. It's so loud. There's so many things happening. So what you're looking at isn't just one announcement. It's the entire financial foundation of the United States moving in the same direction at the same time. And like I said, most people have absolutely no idea that this is happening. And that's why covering this and talking to people about it feels like talking to people about how the sky is purple. And they're like, no, it's not. So it's really a weird place to be, but I'm fascinated by all this transition. And I actually ran into a question that like I can't really shake during this process. And if the same institutions that built the old system that we're currently in, that have benefited from its opacity, its slow settlement, its barriers to entry, if they are now the ones designing the replacement, what actually changes? Because when I look at the world right now, I'm not just seeing financial infrastructure being rebuilt. I'm watching trust erode in real time. And it's happening publicly, repeatedly, and seeming louder and louder every day in ways that are hard to like look away from. And I started to wonder, can a world that's watching all this happen just follow the same world that feels like trust is eroding into a new financial system? And who exactly would they be following? Because currently you have BRICS nations who are actively building alternatives to dollar denominated settlement. You have countries in the global south watching what happens to nations that say yes to dominant power, watching the cost of that yes show up in their climate, their labor, their land. You have a world that is fragmenting faster than any new system can be agreed upon. It seems like almost every day it's fragmenting more. And then there's this. Even if the infrastructure is real, even if the technology works exactly as promised, the institutions accumulating the assets right now, who are controlling the largest or will be controlling the largest liquidity pools, and who are building the interfaces that everyone's going to use, they can shape outcomes without ever touching the underlying chain. And we actually watched this happen separately with the internet when it was created and as it grew. The protocol itself was neutral. HTTP doesn't care who uses it. But the infrastructure built on top got captured, and just a small number of actors ended up with extraordinary power over a system that was supposed to belong to everyone. So I sat with the question like for a while, is there arrogance in believing XRP is the solution? Not a solution, but the solution. When there's actually like an entire world out there that hasn't agreed to what the solution is going to be. And here's what I keep coming back to. And I want to be clear, this isn't optimism. It's just the logic following itself. If BRICS succeeds in building an alternative financial system that still does that, like that itself still does not solve the problem of how BRICS settles with Europe, or how the EU settles with Southeast Asia, or how any of these competing sides with each other, like how, like when they're competing with each other, when none of them will trust the other's infrastructure, like what do you do? And the problem itself doesn't go away when the world fragments. It actually becomes bigger, in my opinion. And I think historically, there has always been something that has to fill the gap when fragmentation occurs. Something that doesn't belong to any single power, that can move between competing systems without carrying the political weight of either. And we saw that with gold, where it played that role for centuries. The dollar played that role when one side won decisively enough to impose this strength. And right now, some of the strongest power in the world seems to be trying to hold on to that dominance harder than ever, in my opinion, and from what I see. But noticing that the pushback to this is very real. And I truly don't think we've seen the end result of what that pushback is. And with what may be coming just around the corner around energy and oil, like in the next few months, the ground underneath all of this is less stable than it looks. And it actually feels that way, I think. So the question isn't whether a neutral settlement layer is needed. The question is whether XRP can actually stay neutral as the most powerful institutions in the world start to embrace it. And that's where it gets genuinely uncertain for me. Not in a way that like breaks the thesis, but excuse me, but in a way that requires honesty. The XRP ledger is a public blockchain. There's no single party that controls the protocol. Transactions are visible. The rules are encoded into the system. You can't just quietly change the ledger at, say, 2 a.m. the way that you can with the private database. That itself is structural neutrality. Not promised structural neutrality, but like built-in structural neutrality. But structural neutrality at the protocol level doesn't automatically translate into practical neutrality in how the system gets used. If the largest liquidity pools, the most widely used on-ramps, and the interfaces most people interact with are all controlled by the same, say, constellation of Western financial institutions, the neutrality of the ledger starts to look more like a legal technicality than a lived reality for, say, a country in the global south trying to settle trade without asking for permission. And we see that today with like sanctions and those kind of things that are imposed. So what actually preserves the neutrality isn't a technology guarantee. It's actually the diversity of who participates that preserves the neutrality, in my opinion. The more independent actors building on it are, the more countries running their own infrastructure on top of it, the more competing powers using it for even different and sometimes opposing reasons. None of them are able to capture it without alienating the other people that are using it or other systems that are using it. And here's the thing about the world fragmenting the way it is right now. That fragmentation might be exactly what keeps the neutral layer neutral. Not because anyone planned it that way, per se, but because if enough competing powers are all depending on the same settlement layer, none of them can take control of it without losing the thing that they rely on. At least I think that's the theory. But we're actually living in a moment which is kind of strange, where it appears that certain people are breaking things that they need. So even that is no longer a guarantee. So here's where I actually am in all of this. The infrastructure itself is real. The timeline for all of this is concrete. The institutions are positioned. The patent names have already named the networks. And the legislation is moving. And none of that is speculation anymore. And I believe, not because I want to, I truly believe, because the logic keeps holding when I stress test all of this. And this is the main thing, the world is moving on chain. And when it does, something neutral will be needed. That the more the world actually fractures, the more valuable a layer that doesn't belong to anyone truly becomes. But I keep landing on a question that I haven't heard answered yet. And I haven't heard it in announcements, not even press releases. And maybe someone somewhere is asking it and I'm just not hearing it. But what about the person who can't afford gas right now? Because all of this, the tokenized treasuries, the settlement rails, the 40% moves on blockchain announcements, it exists at a level that is completely disconnected from where most people actually are today. The transition is happening. And it may be even inevitable. But for the person watching their purchasing power shrink in real time, while the infrastructure of the next financial century gets decided by the same people who decided the last one, the question of whether XRP succeeds is almost secondary. I think the real question is whether any of this gets built in a way that actually reaches the everyday person, or whether the neutral layer just becomes the new plumbing for the same concentration of power that just simply runs faster and cheaper than it did before. And I'm not sure if the cost of being left behind feels higher right now because it actually is, or because for the first time in human history, we can watch the entire world happen in a single scroll from our hand. And maybe it's both. The honest thing is, I don't have a clean answer to that. And I don't think anyone does, at least not yet. But I think it's the right question to be asking. And I think the answer, whatever it turns out to be, is going to depend on how many people are paying attention while all this is being decided. And that's why I'm still here. Because I think it's interesting. I think we're living through one of the biggest transitions that no one is talking about. So if this landed with you, please definitely share this with someone who's been trying to make sense of what's happening in finance right now, but can't find anyone explaining it without their own agenda or without trying to sell something. And if you have a different answer to the last question that I had, I honestly want to hear it. So drop it in the comments. And I'm James Harris. This is Layer 1. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you on the next episode. I got some good stuff coming. Bye.